Now, about Walter. As an author, he's known, of course, for his revealing and vividly told biographies of such accomplished individuals, some past, others contemporary, as Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Jennifer Doudna, and Elon Musk. The list of day jobs Walter himself has held also is impressive. A career in journalism led him to become editor of Time magazine, then chair of CNN. He went on to head the Aspen Institute, and for some years now, he's been a professor of history at Tulane. His new book is slim and succinct. It focuses on just one famous American sentence, the second one in the Declaration of Independence, you know, the one that begins with the resonant phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," contains the revolutionary assertion, "All men are created equal," and ends with the statement that our unalienable rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That 35-word sentence, along with the rest of the Declaration, will be 250 years old next year. Hence, the excellent timing of Walter's book. He recounts who wrote and edited what in that remarkable and memorable sentence, and how Enlightenment notions of natural rights and social contracts influenced the founders in their historic effort to define America's aspirations and values. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Walter Isaacson.
The great Bradley Graham, the great Politics and Prose, y'all are very lucky in Washington to have such an institution. And as Bradley said, we're coming up to our 250th, and that's why I wrote this book. Because, especially those of you in Washington will understand this, we're not in the mood to have a party. We've become very divisive and poisoned in our politics. And it seemed to me that one way to help bring the temperature down and to remind us of our common values would be to have a great celebration of our 250th. I'm quite disappointed. There had been a lot of plans being made for the 250th, at least on the national level, but it had been pretty much disbanded. I think Trump is going to have a World Wrestling exhibition at the White House. I'm not joking. And so some of us, Rick Atkinson in particular, has done the second great volume of The Revolution. Ken Burns has done his thing. John Meacham, Drew Faust. Many of us for the 250th are going to try to rally this notion of coming back to our common values. In fact, I'm meeting with the people at the National Archives tomorrow to see if they can organize it, since nobody else will. It began because in January of 1776, when most people in the colonies were not in favor of revolution, somebody wrote a pamphlet, Thomas Paine. It was called On Common Sense. Thomas Paine was a young Irish immigrant who Ben Franklin had helped set him up as a printer in Philadelphia. And with that pamphlet, he helped change the mood in the colonies to be in favor of breaking with the king. And so, in about June of 1776, the Continental Congress catches up with the mood of the people and decides to have a Declaration of Independence. And they appointed a committee to write the Declaration. It may have been the last time Congress created a great committee. It was Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams on it. And when I was writing about Ben Franklin many years ago, I discovered that there was a first draft of the Declaration of Independence in the Library of Congress. It had never been moved to the archives. It's never really been displayed with the final version. But like Bradley and myself, who started in the 1970s in this craft of journalism, looking at how people edited a sentence was quite inspiring to me. And so basically, this is the first draft of the Declaration. Jefferson's hand, he gets to write it. Ben Franklin does most of the edits, and John Adams. And it inspired me enough that I decided to look at what I think is the greatest sentence ever written by human hand, the We Hold These Truths sentence, which becomes our creed, our mission statement as a nation, and see how they got to it. So if you look closely at that sentence in this first draft, and they go through 4 more drafts, but you can see it right there, which is, we hold these truths. And it says in Jefferson's handwriting, to be sacred. And you can see the printer's pen that Franklin used, the backslashes. And he writes in self-evident, and he's saying we're trying to create a new type of nation in which our rights come from rationality, reason, not the dictates or dogma of a religion. But the sentence goes on. It says that all men are created equal and they are endowed with inalienable rights. And there's John Adams's handwriting. They are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. So you can see even just in the editing of the first half of the sentence, they do something of balance. They balance the role of rationality and reason and the role of divine providence in helping us get our rights in our new nation. One reason is, and I always like to write about scientists and innovators, is that Franklin and Jefferson in particular were scientists. We often think of Ben Franklin as a doddering old dude flying a kite in the rain, saying a penny saved is a penny earned. But actually the electricity experiments, which were done when he was much younger than that picture shows, were the most important scientific experiments of the era. And in particular, he was able to show the flow of electricity, plus and minus, how you balance, how things come in equilibrium, how you store it in batteries. And likewise, Jefferson, very much a scientist. There he is with a bust of Ben Franklin on his desk. And they all studied Isaac Newton. And they understood that at times there are contending forces. And what you have to do is find equilibrium. Newton, of course, gives us all the equations you need to know about how do you bring contending forces into equilibrium. Well, this is something that Jefferson and Franklin and the other founders did, which is they knew that we did not all have the exact same values, but we had to find the equilibrium. We had to find balance, just like they do in that sentence where they talk about the role of divine providence, but they also talk about rationality and reason. They keep it as a balance. I was working on this when I was toiling at CNN. And one day I came into our morning meeting at CNN, and somebody said, we have a great Crossfire show. Most people here are old enough to remember what Crossfire was. Yes, we remember. And I said, what? He said, well, Judge Roy Moore in Alabama has put the 10 Commandments on his courthouse steps. And a federal judge has told him to take it down. He won't. They're going to send in the marshals. And everybody said, that's great. We have a Crossfire show. Who's going to be in favor of the 10 Commandments and who's going to be against the 10 Commandments? And what do? I go, oh, yeah, great. And then I went home that evening. It was 9 o'clock when Larry King came on. And I don't know if I should say this, but when Larry King came on, I could turn off the TV. I was no longer at work. I let him handle it. And I'm looking at how our founders were using religion and rationality to bring us together. And there we were as journalists, and there were the politicians using the 10 Commandments to guide us. And so it made me think that I should really look hard at this sentence, this greatest sentence ever written, and see it's a type of thing in places like this, in churches and sanctuaries or in schoolrooms. We can say it by heart, but we probably don't stop and say, wait, let me look at the profundity of each of these words. Because it really becomes this sentence, the creed, that binds together a nation of pilgrims and of immigrants, a diverse group into one nation, and it defines two great concepts in my mind. Common ground, what's our common ground, and the American dream. And so I'm a little bit hopeful, because I remember the bicentennial. We had just gone through Watergate, we'd gone through Vietnam, we'd gone through the assassination of Kennedy's and King, and the riots. And yet, after all of that, we came together for the bicentennial. Tall ships in our ports, bicentennial minutes on our TV shows, and then the fireworks. Whether it was Gerald Ford and others, it brought us together. I do not see that happening for our 250th, and that's what I'm hoping, that from the ground up, in places like this, groups like this, we say, okay, our national politics isn't ready for it, but we as a people are ready to try to come together and have a celebration in which we look at what these words mean. The first word in the sentence, of course, is we. It happens to be, or it doesn't just happen to be, it is the first word of the Constitution, written 11 years later, we the people. And it seems like a rhetorical flourish unless you look at it carefully. It doesn't mean we, the 59 guys meeting in Philadelphia at the time. What happened was that Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams, all three of them, were scholars of the contract theory, the social contract theory, that was just arising then during the Enlightenment. The notion of Thomas Hobbes, of John Locke, that we were once in a state of nature, and that true governance doesn't come from the divine right of kings or the sword of conquerors. It comes because in the good society, we came out of this anarchistic state of nature, which Thomas Hobbes, he's the first to write about this in the Leviathan. He said, in the state of nature, it's anarchy. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, but people come together and they form a social contract. That's the only real basis for true governance. And John Locke, who is really the patron saint philosopher of the people who wrote the Declaration, in his second treatise on government, he says, what happens is you agree with others to join in a community for the safe and peaceable living, secure enjoyment of their properties. And so that's what they mean by we. They're going back to the social contract theory, saying the rights come from the consent of the governed, and that includes the rights and power of government. Doesn't come from divine right of kings or conquerors. It comes from a social contract that we make. Sentence goes on, we hold these truths to be, as I said, Franklin changes sacred to self-evident. And I never really thought about the phrase self-evident. I thought maybe it was just a fancy way to say obvious. We hold these truths to be obvious. But then I was studying where it came from. And Benjamin Franklin had spent all of 1774 and 1775 in England trying to be our envoy there to hold the colonies and the crown together. But when he realized it was not working, he went and visited David Hume, who was by far the greatest living English language philosopher of the time, up in Edinburgh. David Hume said, invited him up with a wonderful letter saying he's just built this new house and his cook makes the best sheephead soup in all of Europe. Thinking the best is just like being the highest mountain in Louisiana is not. But Franklin went and he stayed for more than a month with David Hume, talking about liberties, where rights come from. And Hume had just come up with a notion of truths. It was a great book, probably the most important philosophical book of the time, called On Human Understanding. And he said there were two types of truths. One were truths of fact, like London is bigger than Philadelphia. The other were self-evident truths of reason, such as all bachelors are unmarried. If you want to understand a truth of fact, you have to go around and figure out, are there more people, how many people are in London, how many in Philadelphia. But if you want to understand an analytic or self-evident truth, you don't have to go around surveying bachelors and asking if any of them have wives. It's a self-evident truth. And this is important because when we get to the all men are the created equal part, well, that's not true in terms of look around. People aren't exactly equal. Some are taller and shorter and better looking and better athletes or not. But in a state of nature, when they all had individual rights and they came together with the social contract, it's self-evident that they're all equal under that social contract. Then you have to look at the phrase all men. I am sure many times the late, great Cokie Roberts spoke at Politics and Prose events, and she wrote a wonderful book called Remember the Ladies, which was about Abigail Adams. And Abigail Adams writes in June of 1776, when John Adams and Franklin and Jefferson are on this committee, saying, remember the ladies. And John Adams writes back, I cannot but laugh. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. So when they say all men, at first I thought it was just a general, expansive term, the way people sometimes say, humankind or mankind. But in fact, they didn't give rights to all men. And then, of course, there's the greatest of the contradictions, which is when they say all men are created equal, they are doing that at a time when 500,000 people in the colonies, 1/5 of the population, are enslaved. And Jefferson himself, it's a person writing it, he includes in the Declaration in the first draft denouncements of slavery, saying how abhorrent the slave trade was, and yet he himself at the time had more than 400 slaves. And if you want to picture that room on Market Street, that picture I showed at the beginning with Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson at a desk, there's actually a fourth person in that room, Robert Hemings, who was a 19-year-old enslaved valet of Thomas Jefferson, whose younger sister, Sally, would become the mother of Jefferson's children. And yet, even when he dies, Jefferson doesn't free Sally Hemings or Robert Hemings. And yet, he's able to write, all men are created equal. And it's, of course, one of the inherent contradictions in our country, but it's also why this sentence is so aspirational. It's a forcing mechanism, because it wasn't true at the time. Even John Adams, who never owned slaves, was an abolitionist, he says, he denounces slavery, but he says the subject is too dangerous to be touched in public. I think Joe Ellis has a book out this past month about how did they make this compromise on slavery, and did they have to? And that's one of the big issues in our nation. I tend to like to look at our nation as an analog, as Ben Franklin's life and the narrative of his life being an analog. Because, no, our nation started off with this sin, and the question is, have we been able to rectify it? Franklin kept, during his lifetime, a ledger of all of the errors and sins he did, and then a right-hand column of how he tried to rectify it. It starts with, he was actually indentured to his brother, runs away and breaks the bounds of indenture. He rectifies it by educating his brother's children when he dies. But near the end, he has this great thing that's in the errata and sins category. He had allowed the advertising of slavery in the Pennsylvania Gazette. He even had 2 enslaved people working for a time in his print shop. But he lets them free, and eventually he becomes one of the strongest voices for abolition. And by the end of his life, at age 80, which back then was considered old, he becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And so in some ways, we can look at that arc and say that is what the arc of American history has been to some extent, should be, and sometimes in fits and starts it isn't, which is taking the phrase, all men are created equal, and making it more and more true and bringing more and more people into that sentence. Women, blacks, Native Americans, expanding the concept of liberty. The sentence actually becomes a forcing mechanism. 7 years after they wrote that sentence, Lincoln invokes it at Gettysburg, invokes that sentence. The Gary Wills book is very interesting about that, because when he's talking about the founding of our country, he's not talking about the Constitution. He's talking about that sentence. And he says, they brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He is that day consecrating a cemetery where they're burying 7,058 people who died to make that sentence a little bit more true. And that's sort of the legacy that we all have to keep up. When the suffragettes in the early 1900s do their founding documents, they invoke the sentence. They invoke, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and they push it for their rights. And of course, Dr. King uses it. And so it's always been a forcing mechanism, this sentence, to make us into a better nation. As I said, John Adams puts in a phrase, endowed by their creator. One small thing I've noticed is that when Jefferson writes it, because John Adams wants it, he doesn't even capitalize creator, even though almost all the nouns are capitalized. But in the final version of the Declaration, it is capitalized. There they are trying to juggle this. It's partly because Jefferson and Franklin in particular were deists. And to some extent, so was John Adams. And deism was an outlook, not exactly a creed, but it was the outlook that was most prevalent during the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, whether it was Voltaire and Rousseau or Jefferson and Franklin, who were avatars of the Enlightenment. They believed in an idea of a creator, but not in an interventionist God, a God who sort of every day sort of did things, affected life, sent down thunderbolts, not a God you could pray to and say, let me have Tulane beat Ole Miss in the college football playoffs. Even the good Lord wouldn't be, able to do that one, I don't think. But they believed in this notion that we should all be awed by the divine providence. Jefferson himself, if you go to Monticello, it's just an amazing thing to see. That's the Jefferson Bible there, in which he cuts out with a razor blade all the mentions of Jesus' miracles, but leaves in Jesus' moral teachings. So that's them wrestling with this notion. And that's what they mean by the laws of nature and of nature's God. I say this because in this contentious political times we're living in, people are trying to capture the founding as being, okay, we're a Christian nation or we're this type of nation. No, they were a balanced nation. They were a nation created in the Enlightenment that was very tolerant of different beliefs, as opposed to trying to impose one type of religion. And then there's the final phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In all previous versions of this, it's life, liberty, and property. That's the way, not just this sentence here, but John Locke has it many times. He talks about life, liberty, estates, and property. And then even in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written about 4 weeks before the Declaration, George Mason, Jefferson's friend, wrote it. It basically says a version of the famous sentence, but it says the means of acquiring property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And so Jefferson, instead of leaving in all the stuffs about property, makes it a very simple sentence, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think he does it because he makes it much more elegant, of course, but also more of a living thing. Each new generation can understand what do we mean by our own fulfillment, our own happiness. It's not just protecting property rights or gaining, wealth. It's about what we do to feel fulfilled. And I think that it gives an expression. They weren't talking about happiness like, let's go have a party next Saturday. They were talking about Plato's concept of the good life and what is fulfillment, what makes us for real. And so they bring it, and they finally get the fifth draft, and they have it signed, and it not only gives us this mission statement, but it gives us, I think, two basic concepts. The first of which I mentioned was common ground. Now, that was also something I didn't think about too much. I went up to Boston to college when I left New Orleans, and there was the Boston Common, there's Cambridge Common. In England, there's Clapham Common. I just thought those were nice parks. No, actually the Commons was something that John Locke helped conceive during the feudal times in England, when most of the great land was owned by a very small part of the aristocracy. But they put some good land aside and called it the Commons. It was where the commoners, and that's where the word commoner comes from, could graze their sheep, plant their gardens, bury their dead, and it gave everybody a stake in society. It wasn't done just out of generosity by the great landowners. It was a way to keep the society stable when there was a disparity of great wealth. As long as everybody felt they had some reason to keep stability in society, they were less likely to pick up the pitchforks and have a populist rebellion, such as we're seeing today. And Locke defended that by saying, if you want private property, he said, is a good thing. If you mix your labor with things you find and you create something of value, you have a right to that as property. But then he adds what's called the Lockean proviso, which is where there is enough and is good left in common for others. And so that has become part of the ethic and practicality of a democratic republic government, is let's put some things in the commons so that everybody has a stake in society. Especially important if you have a society based on wealth and private property. You have to keep some stability and some generosity by putting things in the commons. Benjamin Franklin created the Leather Apron Club in Philadelphia when he was a young tradesman. And they met every Friday to discuss what benefits, what things, what services should be put in the commons. Because they knew it wasn't just about land. And they start first a library company of Philadelphia. And Franklin says, by having a library in which everybody has it in commons, it's a common ground that we share, it means that even those who are born to the least advantaged circumstances have the possibility of acquiring as much knowledge as the richest person in England. It was a way to make it a land of opportunity. Now, we shut down our government when we can't figure out what to do with health care. But it's simply a question of how much health care should be put in the commons. And Franklin, they create the hospital company of Philadelphia. And they make it a public-private partnership, which indeed serves all. And they write, that's Franklin writes the motto, which is, for those of you who don't read Latin, to pour forth benefits for the common good is divine. And so that's what they're doing back then, is when they do the volunteer fire department, they debate in Franklin's Leather Apron Society whether only people who contribute money or volunteer for the fire department should have their homes protected. And they say no, it should be put in the commons. We want to protect the whole town, not just every third house. Likewise, a street sweeping corps, a militia, a night watchman corps, and then a police corps. All of these things were decided that they should be put in the commons. And most important of all, of course, was the Academy for the Education of Youth, which became the University of Pennsylvania, but it was so every person had access to education. That's what we do in our society today. We put certain things, K through 12 education, fire, police, to some extent healthcare, in the commons, and our debates become really bitter, but if we frame them as a way of just saying, all right, it's a balance, like Franklin and Jefferson would do, how much do we balance it? How much of this good do we put in the commons? Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, who is by far the most quoted and least read writer about America, said that there's a great tension in the American spirit between the individualism and the desire to form associations and come together in civic projects. And I think Franklin and the others would say, no, it's not a great tension. They were the types of people who were very rugged individuals, but they came together for volunteer fire departments, quilting bees, barn raisings, militia, and they felt that rugged individuals coming together to do well by the civic good was part of the inheritance of America as it was done. What happens there is you have the commons, and you also have the question of enclosing parts of the commons. There were the enclosure laws in England that allowed people to take parts of the common and have it be the place that they tended, that they did the gardening. And that leads to actually more wealth. It's a good thing when people take responsibility for part of it, but it also carves out part of the commons. That's the tension we've been doing for 250 years, and it's particularly strong in the tension today, which is how much is going to be carved out of the commons. What should be provided in the commons? You know, healthcare, education, police, fire, defense. It requires a balance, and we've lost that ability to figure out balances the way Newton and Jefferson did, and Franklin. The other concept that's inherent in this sentence to me, and inherent in why we have a commons, is the American dream. As I said, the commons is there ever since the time of Locke, partly just out of goodness. You don't want people to go hungry because they have no land. Partly, though, it's a practical reason. You don't want them picking up pitchforks. You want them to believe that the stability of society is a good thing. You don't want them overthrowing society. But there's a third reason, I think, that we have the commons, and that's the moral purpose of the commons, which is it forms the foundation for every kid being able to have an opportunity. If you make sure that kids have safe streets, good schools, good health care, good education, then any person, however they're born, can aspire to do better than their parents. This was particularly key to Benjamin Franklin. If you read the autobiography, it's all about how he enters Philadelphia with just 3 coins in his pocket, but he's able to rise well enough and stand before kings, he says, and be a peer to the kings. He was one of those rags to riches story, and he believed strongly that we had to be a land of opportunity where everybody could rise. It was called the American Dream in, I think, the early part of the Great Depression, early 1930s, by James Truslow Adams in a book called The Epic of America. Michael Sandel writes about this a lot in his book. In fact, I got it from Michael Sandel. I didn't sit there reading James Truslow Adams in my spare time, so I got to give him credit. But he says the American dream is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream basically in which all of us can hope to attain the fullest stature that we're capable, regardless of the circumstances of our birth. That's what really keeps America together, is this notion that however lucky or unlucky you are in birth, it should be a land of opportunity where you can do better. And he used, James Truslow Adams did, a library as his symbol, which would have really appealed to Benjamin Franklin. And that is, you look down at a library, people black and white, executive and labor, general and private, scholar and schoolboy, all get to read, and it's a perfect example, he says, of the American dream. However, in the past 20 or 30 years, some things have started to erode the American dream. One of them is what Sandel calls the skyboxification. It's like what John Locke said about enclosure, where things that were in commons get enclosed. It's the fact that when Sandel and I used to go to Fenway Park, we'd all go through the same gates. Everybody would sit in the same stands. Everybody would eat the same soggy hot dogs. But now, there's the VIP gates and the sky boxes, and we're no longer all sitting together. We're no longer doing what my dad did when he dropped out of Tulane so he could join the Navy, so he didn't miss World War II. There was no sense that we're all in things together. We all now have VIP lines and velvet ropes and red carpets, and even at the airport. Now, I'm hypocritical because I just flew up here, and I took the clear line. I took the TSA. We all do it, but I think we have to be aware that every time we take something out of the commons, every time, with all due respect to Sidwell Friends, we take some part of education out of the commons and make it a skybox for certain people. We have to be aware of what we're doing to the common ground and how that might erode the American dream. Worse yet, it's happened even in our information ecosystem. Just as certain things have been carved off of the commons, we used to have a common ground of information. We used to have a Cronkite saying, that's the way it is, and everybody felt they shared the same sense of facts, at least, and news. But now with media and information ideas, we each go to our different cul-de-sacs online. We get driven to our different ends of the talk radio dial. We pick our cable TV news. We have algorithms that the minute you start liking something on Facebook or on X is bringing you down a rabbit hole and separating you from other people. And so all of this, from talk radio to social media to cable TV, the technology has tended, instead of giving us common ground like it used to, it's tended to disconnect us rather than connect us. It's got a business model that by using an algorithm and dividing you and enraging you, it makes you more engaged and they make more money. But it's not just the social media, it's all of us now have broken up the common ground we used to share of civil discussions and media. And finally, like Benjamin Franklin, I try to think, where was I wrong at times? Benjamin Franklin, when they're doing the Declaration and then the Constitution, he gives a little speech about when we were young tradesmen and we had a joint that didn't hold together, we'd shave from one side, shave to the other, until we had a joint that would hold together for centuries. And so, too, we here at this convention must part with some of our demands. And his point was that compromises may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies. And he said, the way I am able to do that is I look around and I realize I've been wrong at times. He says, I'm older than everybody at this convention, and I realize over the years that other people have been right and I've been wrong. And he says, try it, just think. Maybe the person next to you disagree with may end up being right. And that sort of inspired me to go back and say, what were the big things I was wrong about? I think I was wrong about, and I think many in this room were, and you can argue back if you want, wrong about the notion of globalization. We kind of signed on to the Washington, Davos, Aspen consensus that free trade, free movement of capital, offshoring of jobs would lead to greater wealth, that having a total free trade zones and total movement of factories and capital would just increase wealth so much. Well, that turned out to be right. It increased wealth enormously in the past 40 years. But what we got wrong is it left a lot of people behind. My aunt and uncle in Bogalusa, Louisiana, who had a little factory that made furniture, and they had lumber, and they, made great things. Nobody. It's all done in Malaysia now or something. Bogalusa is a gutted town. It's like that. And so we began to lose the American dream when we cared more about an economy that created wealth than an economy that created a good society. And I think that's why we've had, whether it's Mamdani or Trump or anything, revolts against the system. And it used to be, when I was growing up, on one salary, you could afford usually a home, maybe a car. Nowadays, when I turned 30, it was the exact median age for when people bought homes in my generation, at age 30, and when they got married. Half the people, 50% of the people in my generation at age 30 had a home and were married. Nowadays, that's 12%. We've lost that notion of affordability and the American dream and having a good job that was secure. If you want to just see the statistics of it, if you were born in the early 50s, you had an 80% chance of being financially more successful than your parents. Nowadays, it's less than half. It's 49%. When less than half the people think they're going to do better than the previous generation, you can tell why there's been this disruption coming from the end of the American dream. And that led me to ask, almost based on this sentence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what is the purpose of an economy? Well, one purpose of the economy is to create wealth. Indeed, our economy has done that. And it's also growth. And yeah, we've been very good at that. But thoughtful people on both sides of the aisle, Orrin Cass has a good book about it. He advises J.D. Vance, but so do many others. And so would Jefferson say, no, there's a deeper purpose to an economy. The purpose to an economy, the deeper purpose, is to create a good society. And that's what that sentence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is all about. When they sign it, John Hancock famously puts his John Hancock on it and says, we must all hang together. There's Dr. Franklin in the front row, the wit, who refers to what's going to happen if they don't hang together. He said, yes, we must all hang together, or otherwise, most assuredly, we'll all hang separately. And that's what I think we have to do for our 250th. We have to start thinking again, what policies can we adopt, what balances can we craft that will strengthen the commons, the common ground. And in an era where we don't have universal service, where my dad doesn't automatically go off in a platoon with people from different backgrounds, what can we do? What institutions can we do that would instill a sense of shared service across class lines? How do we make sure kids have an equal opportunity? Even as we build great schools and other things, how do we make sure that community colleges, which were basically free 40 years ago, are now unaffordable to more than half the people? why are we moving away from this concept we could all agree on, is that whatever your politics, you want every kid to be given an opportunity. And then for those of us in the craft of information, media, and publishing, how are we going to create news outlets? But not just news outlets and social media platforms, which I ask my students, okay, create me a Twitter or an X that brings us together rather than divides us. But it's not just that. It's things like tonight, which are civic discussions, Thanksgiving dinners, all, how are we going to have personal conversations that connect us to our common ground rather than inflame our resentments? As usual, I'll go back to Franklin. He starts the hospital there that makes sure that there's health care in the commons. He has the Academy for the Education of Youth. He has a library he's built. And at one point, and he has the Pennsylvania Gazette, the first newspaper that wasn't beholden to any party, he said. It was for all opinions to see if we can find common ground. And that is what's called the New Hall. It was built just behind Independence Hall. And it was built so that preachers of the Great Awakening could come and there would be a place for them to preach. And Franklin wrote the fundraising document. He said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn. And on his deathbed, he was the largest individual contributor to the Congregation Mikveh Israel, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. So when he died, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews and marched with him to the grave. That's what they were fighting for when they crafted this sentence, and that's what we're still fighting for today. Thank you. I will now, 5:50. Bradley said, speak for 50 minutes. And there was no clock. And it's 5:50. Yes, a miracle. So we have 10 minutes for questions. And I'm going to let her take the onus of picking the people. But
Good evening. Thank you so much for your insights. It was really interesting to hear everything you had to say. I'm a teacher, and I used to teach high school history, political science, English. I lectured a lot, and then I repurposed into working with refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. And my students now, I work with teaching them A and B and C.
well, thank you for your service. Yeah.
So my journey is backward from the way I learned. And I have a question for you. And that is, what do we tell people who are coming to this country and want to be citizens, that this is a good place and that the social contract will be honored?
Well, it's only, Dr. King said the arc of history, bends towards justice. It actually doesn't. It has to be bent. It's human hands have to make it that way. We have to make that country again because we don't exactly have it right now. Yes, sir. No, I'm sorry. He has a microphone, but I'll tell him to give it to you next.
Yeah, Professor Isaacson, I have the connection to Tulane. I'll talk to you later.
Sorry?
I have connection to Tulane University. I'll talk to you later about that. But my question is, through your books, you've written these incredible stories of people ranging from Steve Jobs to Elon Musk and others, Jennifer Doudna, incredible biographies and stories about them. But I'd venture to say Elon Musk, a compatriot of mine, has the most screwed up values. He's brilliant in other areas, but his values are the opposite of anything to do with a social contract.
Right.
So when you interview them and write the whole book, I'm interested in your feelings about the person when you finish the book.
Well, I think it's in the book, my feelings, which is that he does not have any empathy or feel for the social contract. but he's also complicated. He's the only person who can get rockets into orbit and land them upright or bring us to the era of electric vehicles. And one of the things we have to do in life is realize that some of our heroes are complex. Jefferson owned slaves. Henry V, in Shakespeare, kills all the prisoners. So it's hard in this day and age of, in 140 characters, somebody's either got to be the hero or a villain, to say there's a complexity here. But there's a real complexity, a dark, dark demon side, but also an amazing engineering side on Elon Musk. And I tend to like to write about complex people. I haven't taken on Jefferson yet, but that's for Meacham to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Isaacson. I played the viola in ninth grade in a pit orchestra of a community theater production of the musical 1776, and it profoundly influenced the way I think about the way the Declaration of Independence was written. My question to you is that since Jefferson changed the three pillars that you've mentioned that John Locke created, life, liberty, and property, into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in your view, was that Jefferson's sort of explanation or expansion of his view of natural law, or was that quintessentially an American view on life?
I think he was actually reading Plato at the time in The Good Life, but he wanted a sentence that lived and breathed, that each generation could say it's not just about wealth, it's not just about property, it's about the pursuit of happiness. And he was just a very good writer, too. That phrase works better than the pursuit of property. Yeah. Okay, in the back. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you my microphone because you've been, yeah.
Hello, thank you for this talk. My name's Andrew. I was wondering, you said you did 18 interviews with Henry Kissinger and when you wrote the biography on him. I was wondering, what do you think was the most telling thing he said or revealing in your memory?
You're going way back into my history here. That was 40 years ago. The most telling thing he said. I think the most telling thing is in the last chapter, which is when he talks about, I talk about the morality being a basis of American foreign policy and one of its strengths. And he says, no, that's an American sentimentalism. America has to learn to be more realistic, and that we should not base foreign policy on what he calls naive good intentions. I think that's a big tension in American foreign policy. To what extent are we idealist, and to what extent are we realists? And once again, I'm in the camp of balance. You have to weave them together the way, say, a Brent Scowcroft, who worked for Henry Kissinger, did, and were able to, or Madeleine Albright did. But I think, I'm not taking the wittiest statement. I'll give you what he said. He was in a group like this, and he looks out, and he says, I've never seen such a distinguished sea of faces since I last dined in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles alone. So I can give you his quips, but the bigger one is the notion that American foreign policy had to be less idealistic, which I don't believe is true, but that's part of the theme of the book.
I've got one, thank you. The Committee of Five, we know a lot about Adams and Ben Franklin. What about Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston?
Very good. You're the first person to catch me on the fact that the main three in that painting I showed were Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. But there are two other people, Roger Sherman and Livingston, on it. And every now and then in life you have to say, I don't know. Because I tried to, Livingston's very much a mercantilist in his thinking, but I don't see their handwriting in the document, so that's why I left them out. Yeah, I'm going to start calling on people, and I'll try to do this quick. I know some of you have to go, so sneak out. Because
A quick question. The first half of your book and the first half of your talk parses every word.
Yeah.
The second half of your book, where you talk about the commons and the American dream, is an interpretation. And the question I have is, how do we build it into the narrative so that it is perceived to be part of our history and not just our dream?
Right. I mean, it starts with the word we, which, if you don't gloss over it, means common ground. And it ends with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the American dream. The problem we have with this sentence is, as I said, we kind of say it by rote, but we don't stop to say we. Well, that implies a social contract, and that means we have shared commons and values and goods. So let's look at it. That's why I wrote this book, which is like, okay, parse this word we, parse this phrase, pursuit of happiness. And I try to tie it, and others may do it differently, but I tie it to those two concepts that also come from Locke to some extent, which is common ground, the commons, and what gets called the American dream, making sure something's a land of opportunity. All I know is that I hope a lot of us talk about the Declaration, write little books about it, and get people to think again. This is our mission statement. This is what we're supposed to do. So let's figure out what it means.
Walter, you do a great job for the intellectual vitality of these folks. But what was it that allowed them to shelve their egos during that, especially about the claimed authorship of the Declaration? And
Well, they don't shelve their egos on claiming authorship, because John Adams, who never really conquered his ego, to his death, which is on the same day as Jefferson dying, he's complaining that, because John Adams thought, well, go ahead, sorry.
No, but related to that, and this is, what would you put in the epilogue to the Musk biography, given the last 2 years since you were here?
All right, I'm only going to answer the first half of that question. I don't feel like going back to Musk at the moment. Well, as you know, Adams resented Jefferson and resented Franklin, too. He said people say Franklin took his cane and brought lightning from the gods and scepter from tyrants, and they'll say Jefferson gave us the Declaration. John Adams had proposed the July 2nd resolution that they vote on to declare independence. He thought that that was going to be the famous thing. And so the rest of his life, he's right, well, they gave it to Jefferson because he was a Virginian and they needed Virginia, or he was a better writer and stuff. But if you read Jefferson, he says, no, nobody was going to let John Adams do it. They do come together at the very end, which is a hopeful sign, because it's pretty bad throughout the elections of 1800, 1804. But as they're dying, Adams's last words are, Thomas Jefferson still lives, which was technically not true. He had just died at Monticello. And so if they can come together, we can come together. All right, let's do one, two, oh, okay. I know people want to leave, though, too. Yeah. Over here. Oh, I'm sorry. I gotta go by the rules.
Fellow Tulanian, question on civics education writ large. I run a small war veterans organization made up of admirals and generals, mostly retired. One of our focuses is civics education, working with the Jack Miller Center and others. Thoughts on how we could improve that across the country?
Well, I think we could start with the 250th and make it a forcing mechanism that everybody in every community, I've gone around to certain communities, Austin, Chattanooga, Nashville, places, and say, national government's not going to help here. They're not going to make a good celebration. So you have to have, for 1 year, this coming year, a civic celebration of what it is that made us a nation. And if we do it for 1 year, maybe we'll get into the habit of doing it more. Sandra Day O'Connor did a lot of work in that field, too. But I also believe the best way to do civics is to do history. Where's the mic?
Hi. Maybe linked to this, do you think there should be a compulsory civic service? And
When I was at
probably that couldn't actually be compulsory. So then the next part would be, how would we inspire people to pitch in, especially young people, to build the commons in such a divisive environment?
When I was at the Aspen Institute, we started working on this, and Stan McChrystal, who is still leading such an effort, created what I didn't have much to do with. He was so gung-ho, but I got to name it, and we named it the Franklin Project for obvious reasons. And he went to Gettysburg, and we met there. And it was to try to create a sense of national service. And it was a question you asked, which is, should it be compulsory national service? I, for many, many years, was chair of the board of Teach for America, because I believe in national service. That's not as grand as it sounds. It means you, like Prince Philip did to the Queen, you walk 4 steps behind Wendy Kopp and hold her purse and take donations. So she was the one who ran it. But it was important that people got out of their zip codes, out of their comfort zones, and taught at the Schonberg School in New Orleans or the one in Harlem or wherever it may be. What we ended up doing with the Franklin Project, and what Stan and General McChrystal is still doing, is we phrased it this way. Every kid should have the opportunity and the expectation of doing 2 years of service. And it was not something you were going to make compulsory, but people would start asking, just like my father's generation would ask, what did you do during the war? If you were being interviewed by Goldman Sachs, they'd say, where did you do your service? And it was going to try to do that. That kind of got blown up at the very first Trump administration, and the air has gone out of that. But if I were advising somebody running for president, it'd be, you can help heal, the message is heal us, bring us together, find our common ground, and call us to national service. One more. Oh. All right, we'll end there, but I'll do the other questions later. Thank you all very much.